7 million years ago, if you had walked across the wide grasslands of South America, you would not have seen big cats stalking the plains. There would have been no large mammal hunters in sight. The tallest moving shapes on the land were birds, not gentle ones, not small ones, but towering flightless hunters, some standing as tall as a person, moving on long, powerful legs through open plains and warm wind. They did not live in trees, they did not glide or soar. They ran. Fossils tell us they were fast, with heavy skulls and strong curved beaks, built to catch and hold struggling prey. For millions of years, these birds were among the most powerful predators in their ecosystems. Smaller animals learned to move carefully. Open spaces grew quiet. Life shaped itself around their presence. They survived changes in climate. They lived through rising mountains and shifting seas. They endured while many other creatures faded away. And then, slowly, they were gone. No living descendants. No birds today that still walk the land the way they once did. So what changed? What could remove a predator that had ruled its world for so long? How does a creature built for speed and strength still end in silence? And what happens to an ecosystem when its most dangerous hunters disappear? Tonight, we drift gently into the deep past to listen for the moment when the reign of the terror birds came to an end. But before we begin, if this quiet story is bringing you a little comfort, I'd love it if you gave this one a like and maybe tapped subscribe. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far across the world this little sleepy corner of science travels. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and together let's drift gently into the long shadow of the terror birds. What scientists call terror birds are not legends or exaggerations, but a family of real animals known through scattered bones and patient reconstruction. Their name comes from a modern label, not from anything they knew themselves, a way for paleontologists to describe a group of large flightless predatory birds that once dominated the ground. They belong to a single extended lineage, closely related to modern birds, and their shared traits appear again and again in fossils found across the southern half of the world. Long legs, deep skulls, and powerful beaks form a pattern that speaks of pursuit rather than ambush, of open land rather than forest shade, of predators built to move forward rather than wait. Their world stretched wide across ancient South America, a continent that for much of its history stood apart from the rest of Earth. Fossils show them inhabiting grasslands, scrublands, and lightly wooded plains, places shaped by wind and sun rather than dense canopy. In some regions, their remains appear alongside early mammals that had never encountered a large land predator before. Other traces suggest they wandered close to coastlines and river margins, adapting easily to the shifting borders of water and land. Over time, a few lineages spread farther, reaching places that would later connect to North America, carrying their hunting style into new terrain without losing their essential form. Across millions of years, these birds diversified quietly. Paleontologists recognize many distinct species, ranging from smaller, lightly built runners to immense forms that towered over most other animals around them. Each species carried subtle differences in skull shape, leg length, and body mass, hints of specialization within a shared design. Some favored speed and endurance, others leaned toward strength and bone-crushing force. Together they formed not a single monster, but a whole spectrum of predators, filling roles that mammals would not claim until much later in Earth's story. Despite their size and power, terror birds were not dinosaurs, even though they often feel like echoes of that earlier age. Dinosaurs belong to an older branch of the reptile family tree, while these birds emerged long after that lineage vanished. Their bones tell a different story. Lightweight structures appear beneath their strength, and their joints reflect the movement patterns of birds rather than reptiles. Their ancestry traces through avian lines that survived the Great Extinction, gradually adapting to a world where flight was no longer their advantage. In every meaningful sense, they were birds. Feathers once covered their bodies, even if those feathers served insulation and display rather than lift. Their beaks were keratin sheaths, not toothed jaws, shaped by growth rather than replacement. Their eggs, metabolism, and internal anatomy followed avian rules, refined and reinforced through time. They breathed and moved like birds, their bodies balanced by tails reduced to memory, their posture upright and alert. What set them apart was not a departure from birdhood, but an extreme expression of it. Seen through this lens, terror birds were not mistakes or anomalies, but solutions. In a world without mammalian hunters, birds stepped forward to fill the role, reshaping themselves to meet the demands of land and prey. Their story is not one of confusion between categories, but of clarity, showing how flexible and inventive life can be when given space and time. The bodies of the terror birds reveal a kind of quiet precision, shaped less by spectacle than by repeated success. Their most striking feature was the beak, large and deeply curved, forming a solid hook at the tip. This was not a delicate tool meant for probing or tearing plants. It carried weight, density, and balance, designed to meet resistance without shattering. The surface was smooth and strong, grown from living tissue that thickened over time, allowing it to withstand impacts that would have damaged lighter skulls. In life, that beak would have filled the air with a dull, final sound each time it met flesh or bone. Beneath the beak, the skull itself functioned as more than a container for senses and thought. Its structure reveals reinforced regions, especially along the top and back, where stresses from repeated blows would have concentrated. Rather than gripping and shaking prey, these birds relied on downward motion, lifting the head and bringing it down with controlled force. Paleontologists compare this motion to a chopping action, not because it was crude, but because it focused energy into a narrow path. Each strike transferred momentum from the neck, through the skull, and into the beak, turning the head into a single unified tool. The neck played a central role in this design. Long and muscular, it curved naturally, storing potential energy even while at rest. Layers of muscle wrapped around strong vertebrae, allowing swift extension and powerful contraction. This anatomy supported sudden acceleration, enabling the head to move faster than the body itself. In open terrain, this would have allowed a terror bird to dispatch prey quickly, reducing struggle and conserving energy. The neck was neither flexible for delicacy nor rigid for endurance, but tuned for short, decisive motions that ended encounters swiftly. Below this upper framework, the legs carried the animal through its world. They were long and straight, with joints aligned for forward movement rather than climbing or grasping. The bones show signs of lightness without fragility, hollowed in places yet reinforced where forces peaked. Muscles anchored along the hips and thighs provided explosive power, translating stored energy into speed. These legs did not favor sudden turns or leaps upward, but long strides that ate up distance across open ground. Speed, in this context, was not simply about pursuit, it shaped behavior and opportunity. The ability to run swiftly meant these birds could patrol wide territories, arrive first at signs of movement, and dictate the direction of encounters. Their posture kept the body balanced over the legs, head held forward, eyes aligned with the horizon. Movement became smooth and economical, allowing sustained travel without exhaustion. Over time, this efficiency would have mattered as much as raw power, letting them dominate landscapes rather than isolated moments. When viewed together, beak, skull, neck, and legs form a single integrated system. Each part supports the others, creating a predator built not for chaos but for control. Nothing in their anatomy was wasted. Every curve and connection speaks of a life spent moving, watching, and acting with measured force. In these bodies, nature refined a design that turned birds into rulers of the ground, not by abandoning their origins, but by pushing them to a quiet, formidable extreme. Hunting for terror birds unfolded across open ground, guided by movement rather than concealment. They did not wait in shadow or rely on surprise from cover. Their world offered wide sight lines, and they met it upright, scanning the land with steady focus. When prey began to move, the response was gradual at first, a shift in posture, a change in direction, the long legs adjusting their rhythm. Acceleration followed smoothly, not in a sudden burst, but as a measured build of speed that narrowed distance without wasting energy. The chase itself became a test of endurance and timing, shaped by patience as much as power. As they ran, their bodies remained balanced and quiet. The head stayed level, eyes fixed forward, the neck held in a gentle curve that absorbed motion rather than magnifying it. Each stride carried them farther across the plains, covering ground efficiently while keeping control over direction. Prey that fled in straight lines lost ground quickly. Prey that turned sharply lost balance. Over open terrain, there were few places to hide and fewer ways to outlast a predator built for sustained pursuit. The outcome was often decided before contact ever occurred. When the distance closed, the final moments were brief. Terror birds did not grapple or wrestle with their prey. They did not rely on forelimbs to pin or tear. Instead, they rose slightly on their legs, drawing the neck upward, aligning the skull with a narrow target. Then the head came down. The motion was fast but controlled, driven by the combined force of neck muscles and body weight. The beak met flesh or bone with concentrated impact, delivering damage that ended resistance quickly. In many cases, a single precise strike would have been enough. The beak itself served multiple purposes during these encounters. Its hooked shape allowed it to catch and hold briefly, preventing escape during the moment of impact. The thickened structure resisted cracking under stress, even when striking hard surfaces. After the initial blow, smaller adjustments followed, repositioning the head to deliver additional strikes if needed. There was no tearing frenzy, no prolonged struggle. The method favored efficiency, reducing injury risk to the hunter and minimizing energy loss. Claws and teeth, so prominent in mammalian predators, were unnecessary within this strategy. Terror birds did not need to grapple prey into submission. Their legs were designed for movement, not grasping, with toes built to support weight rather than seize. Teeth, replaced repeatedly in many animals, offered no advantage over a beak that grew and renewed itself continuously. By concentrating lethality into the head and neck, these birds avoided the complexity of multi-limb attacks. The body remained free to balance, move, and retreat if needed, even in close quarters. Once prey was subdued, feeding followed a similar simplicity. The beak could tear flesh into manageable portions, leveraging the same strength used in the strike. There was no delicate processing, only steady, purposeful consumption. This approach fit an animal that lived in open landscapes where speed mattered more than secrecy and decisiveness mattered more than endurance at close range. Through this hunting style, terror birds shaped their ecosystems quietly. Their presence influenced how other animals moved, where they grazed, and when they chose to run. The land itself, became patterned by avoidance and caution. In this way, hunting was not just an act, but a constant pressure woven into the daily rhythm of life under their long, steady gaze. South America, during this long chapter of Earth's history, existed as a world apart, shaped by distance as much as by climate. Vast plains stretched beneath open skies, interrupted by low forests, winding rivers, and rising mountain chains still finding their form. Seasonal winds moved freely across the land, carrying dust, seeds, and the steady rhythm of grazing herds. The continent held a balance that felt complete within itself, where life unfolded according to patterns that had settled over millions of years without outside interruption. This separation was not accidental. Tectonic motion had slowly carried South America away from neighboring land masses, leaving it surrounded by wide oceans that acted as barriers rather than bridges. The seas were not empty highways but living borders, deep and restless, difficult for large land animals to cross. Without frequent connections, migration slowed to a near standstill. Species that arose here adapted inwardly, responding to local pressures rather than distant competition. Evolution became a quiet conversation within the continent, unhurried and largely uninterrupted. Within this enclosed world, mammals followed a different path than they did elsewhere. Many were small, cautious, and specialized for survival rather than dominance. Some grazed, others burrowed, and many learned to disappear into cover at the first sign of danger. There were predators among them, but none grew large enough or fast enough to challenge the reigning hunters of the plains. Without outside arrivals to disrupt this balance, mammals never stepped into the role of apex predator. That absence left a space at the top of the food web, and birds rose to fill it. Over time, terror birds became the defining presence of the landscape. Their movements shaped how other animals traveled and where they chose to feed. Herds adjusted their routes, staying closer together or closer to shelter. Smaller creatures learned to move at certain times of day or remain still for long stretches. The land itself seemed to respond, with open areas becoming zones of caution and river edges offering brief refuge. The dominance of a single predator lineage simplified the structure of the ecosystem, concentrating pressure rather than spreading it across many competing hunters. This simplicity carried stability. With one primary threat, prey species refined their responses, becoming faster, lighter, or more alert rather than developing heavy defenses. Plants adapted as well, shaped indirectly by grazing patterns and the movements of herds driven by pursuit. Fire, drought, and seasonal shifts came and went, yet the underlying order held. The terror birds endured these changes, their reign stretching across spans of time that outlasted many other dominant animals elsewhere on the planet. Isolation also meant limitation. Without new predators arriving to test them, terror birds refined a strategy that worked exceptionally well within their closed system. They became specialists of open ground, of pursuit rather than ambush, of control rather than chaos. This specialization brought efficiency but narrowed their range of responses. The continent remained a stable stage, but its very stability prevented the gradual preparation for upheaval. In this long, quiet age, South America moved at its own pace through deep time. Life there did not rush toward change, nor did it sense what lay beyond the surrounding seas. The continent existed under the shadow of one dominant hunter, balanced and complete within its isolation, unaware that distance itself was slowly shrinking, grain by grain, mile by mile, beneath the restless motion of the earth. Life beneath the presence of terror birds unfolded as a quiet negotiation between movement and stillness. For the animals that shared their world, survival depended less on strength and more on awareness. Bodies gradually changed in subtle ways, shaped by generations that learned which traits allowed one more sunrise. Limbs grew longer and lighter, favoring speed over mass. Muscles shifted toward endurance rather than power. Eyes moved outward on skulls, widening fields of view and catching motion early across open ground. Fear did not carve itself into life as panic, but as refinement. Prey animals became alert without being frantic, tuned to small changes in wind and vibration, ears angled toward distant footfalls. Noses learned to read the air for disturbance rather than scent alone. Even posture changed, with heads lifting higher above the grass to watch the horizon. These adaptations carried a cost, demanding constant attention, yet they also brought balance, allowing animals to coexist with a predator that could not be confronted directly. Over time, bodies reflected this constant vigilance. Heavy armor offered little advantage against a hunter that struck from above with speed and precision. Thick hides slowed movement and increased fatigue. Instead, selection favored narrow frames, flexible spines, and joints capable of sudden acceleration. Many species lost the bulk seen in their relatives elsewhere, becoming lean silhouettes shaped for immediate flight. Survival rested not in resisting attack, but in avoiding it altogether. Escape became the central strategy, expressed in countless variations. Some animals relied on pure speed, bolting across open ground in long, straight lines. Others mastered erratic movement, veering suddenly to disrupt pursuit. Still others timed their activity carefully, feeding during hours when visibility dropped and predators were easier to detect from a distance. Groups formed and dissolved fluidly, not for defense, but for shared vigilance, many eyes scanning while many legs stood ready. This way of life shaped behavior as deeply as anatomy. Grazing became cautious and intermittent, rest came in short intervals rather than deep sleep. Young learned quickly, guided by instinct and observation rather than prolonged care. Mistakes carried immediate consequences, and those lessons echoed forward through generations. In this environment, intelligence expressed itself through attention and restraint, not curiosity or confrontation. The land bore the marks of this relationship. Trails curved away from open centers toward edges and cover. Watering sites showed patterns of brief visits rather than prolonged gathering. Even plant communities responded, as grazing pressure shifted with the movement of wary herds. The ecosystem settled into a rhythm governed by anticipation, where motion was deliberate and pauses were meaningful. Within this quiet tension, life remained abundant. Terror birds did not empty the land of prey, nor did prey exhaust themselves into absence. Instead, both sides adapted to one another, creating a dynamic balance sustained across deep time. The birds hunted efficiently, and the animals beneath them learned the art of leaving before danger arrived. In this shared space, evolution favored those who understood when to move and when to remain unseen. Living under terror birds meant existing in a world where the open sky was both warning and guide. Survival was written into the angles of bones and the timing of steps, into bodies shaped not for conflict, but for departure. The reign of the terror birds did not unfold as a brief episode or a dramatic spike in dominance. It stretched across deep time, steady and unbroken, lasting for millions of years in a way that allowed their presence to fade into the background of life itself. Generations rose and fell beneath the same looming silhouettes. Rivers shifted their courses, climates warmed and cooled, and the land slowly reshaped itself, yet these birds remained. Their rule persisted longer than many famous dynasties of the natural world, outlasting creatures that elsewhere seemed invincible. Through this immense span, terror birds were not newcomers testing their place. They were established forces, refined by countless seasons of success. Each generation inherited a world already tuned to their hunting style, and in turn reinforced it. Small changes accumulated slowly, not as leaps of innovation, but as careful refinements layered atop what already worked. Their bodies did not need radical transformation, only maintenance and subtle adjustment, as the pressures they faced changed little within their isolated domain. This longevity carried weight. In ecosystems measured over millions of years, stability often signals resilience. Species that endure across shifting climates and geography tend to do so because they are adaptable within a range of conditions. Terror birds lived through cooling periods and warmer intervals. They persisted as forests waxed and waned, and as grasslands expanded beneath open skies. Their prey changed shape and size, yet the birds continued to thrive, adjusting pace and strategy without losing their role at the top. Because of this, their reign came to feel permanent within the rhythm of the continent. Life evolved as though these predators were part of the landscape itself, as constant as mountains or prevailing winds. Nothing rose to challenge them, and nothing displaced them through slow competition. Their dominance did not flicker or falter in the fossil record. It held, quietly and firmly, across stretches of time that dwarf human history. This deep endurance is what makes their disappearance so striking. Species that linger for only short windows often vanish with little notice, replaced before their absence reshapes the system. Terror birds were different. Their long presence had braided them into every level of the ecosystem. Their removal was not the quiet loss of one thread, but the sudden absence of a central tension that had guided movement, behavior, and balance for ages. Extinction, in this case, did not follow a long visible decline marked by steady weakness. It arrived after prolonged success, after adaptation had already proven itself against countless trials. The contrast between their stability and their eventual erasure stands out against the deep calm of their history. A lineage that had weathered so much, that had persisted through changes that erased others, did not simply drift away into obscurity over endless time. Instead, their absence feels abrupt when viewed against the scale of their rule. Millions of years of dominance end within a comparatively narrow band of geological time. The land that had long carried their shadows adjusted quickly, as though releasing a held breath. Where once their presence was assumed, silence followed. In this way, the long reign of the terror birds sharpens the mystery of their end. It reminds us that endurance does not guarantee survival, and that even the most established rulers of an ecosystem can vanish, not because they were weak, but because the world beneath them finally changed in ways their long success had never required them to prepare for. Far from the plains where terror birds still ruled, change was already unfolding beneath oceans and continents, slow enough to escape notice by any living creature. The ground itself was in motion, not as a sudden rupture, but as a patient rearrangement driven by heat deep within the planet. Vast plates of rock drifted over softer layers below, pressing, pulling, and sliding in directions measured not in seasons but in ages. To life on the surface, the world appeared still. Beneath it, the map of Earth was quietly being redrawn. South America did not remain fixed in its solitude. The ocean separating it from neighboring land was wide and restless, yet the distance between shores shortened by almost nothing each year. Mountains rose elsewhere as plates collided. Seafloors spread and cooled, carrying continents along like slow passengers. These movements were not guided by purpose or design. They followed the simple rules of pressure and release, repeated endlessly as the planet shed its internal heat. From the perspective of living ecosystems, isolation felt permanent. Generations passed without any hint of outside influence. Predators and prey refined themselves within closed boundaries, adapting only to what they knew. Yet isolation on Earth is rarely absolute. Even the widest oceans are temporary features on geological scales. Coastlines shift, currents change direction, islands surface and sink. Pathways that once seemed impossible slowly take shape without ceremony. As South America continued its gradual journey, its northern edge edged closer to other landmasses. The change was subtle, masked by familiar skies and repeating seasons. No alarm signaled that separation was weakening. Rivers still followed their courses. Grasslands still breathed under wind and sun. Terror birds continued to hunt, unaware that the conditions which favored them were tied to distance as much as to skill. Continental drift carries a quiet inevitability. Given enough time, separation gives way to contact, and contact reshapes life more profoundly than climate alone. New land bridges do not appear as sudden doors thrown open, but as narrow margins of possibility. Shallow waters replace deep channels. Chains of islands rise where open sea once lay. For plants and animals, these changes create rare opportunities to move, to arrive, to encounter forms of life shaped by very different pressures. This slow convergence does not announce itself as danger. It feels more like background noise to the long rhythm of Earth, yet it carries with it an invisible promise of disruption. Ecosystems that evolved inward suddenly face outward influences. Strategies refined in isolation meet alternatives forged elsewhere. Balance built over millions of years becomes subject to comparison and competition. The terror birds lived at a time when the continent still felt self-contained. Their dominance was reinforced by the absence of rivals who could test their methods. But that absence depended on geography remaining stable, on oceans continuing to separate worlds that had once been joined. As plates crept forward, that condition weakened. The Earth does not preserve isolation indefinitely. Its surface is restless by nature, always rearranging the relationships between land, sea, and life. In this way, the beginning of the end did not start with the birds themselves, nor with the animals beneath their watchful presence. It began with stone moving against stone, far beyond any horizon they could see. The ground carried on its slow drift, indifferent to who ruled above it, shaping future encounters long before they became possible. The slow approach of North and South America unfolded so gradually that it went unnoticed by the lives unfolding upon them. What had once been separated by wide, uninterrupted ocean began to narrow through steady geological motion. Plates continued their patient drift, lifting sections of seabed while lowering others, reshaping coastlines without sound or signal. Waterways shallowed, volcanic arcs rose and cooled. Islands appeared where only waves had moved before, forming scattered stepping stones between worlds that had long evolved apart. Currents shifted as the shape of the oceans changed. Warm and cold waters followed new paths, subtly altering climate along distant shores. Rainfall patterns adjusted, winds bent differently around emerging land, and seasons adopted slightly altered rhythms. These changes arrived softly, layered over countless generations, blending into what life accepted as normal. Yet they were signs of connection forming, not only between continents, but between entire biological histories that had never met. As land crept closer, movement became possible in ways it had not been before. Small animals traveled first, crossing narrow passages, drifting on debris, or following chains of islands that offered brief rest. Seeds moved with them, carried in fur, feathers, or water. Plants established themselves in new soils, reshaping local habitats step by step. Each arrival was minor on its own, yet together they marked the beginning of exchange, a quiet mixing of lineages shaped in isolation for immense spans of time. When firmer land bridges finally emerged, the transition accelerated. Larger animals found routes across terrain that no longer ended in open sea. The boundary that once protected South America from outside influence softened, then dissolved. Life that had evolved under different rules entered a continent shaped by long familiarity. Predators, accustomed to competition, arrived alongside prey used to entirely different threats. The ecological balance, refined through isolation, encountered alternatives forged elsewhere. This moment stands as a turning point because connection changes everything. Isolation encourages specialization within a closed system, allowing certain strategies to flourish without challenge. Connection introduces comparison. Abilities once sufficient must now contend with others, and success becomes relative rather than absolute. Competition reshapes food webs, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly, depending on how prepared existing species are for novelty. For South America, this shift meant the arrival of mammals adapted to pursue prey with teeth, endurance, and cooperation. Their presence did not immediately erase what came before, but it altered the landscape of survival. Prey species faced new patterns of danger, and predators that had ruled unchallenged began to share space. The continent moved from a single dominant design toward a more crowded and complex hierarchy. From a broader view, this connection reflects a recurring rhythm in Earth's history. Continents separate and reunite, carrying with them distinct experiments in life. When they meet again, the results are rarely gentle, but they are always transformative. The blending of worlds introduces innovation, pressure, and change, often setting the stage for extinction as well as diversification. In this slow convergence, the fate of long established rulers was tied not to their own actions, but to the restless nature of the planet itself. The Earth does not preserve boundaries forever. It rearranges its surface, drawing distant lands together, and in doing so, reshapes the course of life. What follows is not immediate collapse, but a gradual recalibration, where survival is rewritten through contact and ancient certainties begin to loosen without ceremony. The arrival of new hunters did not come as a single wave, but as a gradual seep of unfamiliar forms into familiar land. As connections strengthened, mammals shaped by distant pressures began to appear, carrying bodies and behaviors refined in crowded ecosystems. They moved differently across the ground, low and forward, their weight distributed for endurance rather than speed alone. Their presence did not immediately overturn the old order, but it added new motion to the edges of the landscape. Wolf-like predators arrived with a way of hunting that relied on persistence and cooperation. They traveled in loose groups, reading one another's movement through posture and sound. Their strength lay not in a single decisive strike, but in the ability to follow, to test, and to wear down. Long legs carried them across wide ranges, and their senses tracked scent and fatigue over time. This style of pursuit contrasted sharply with the swift, solitary control exercised by terror birds, introducing a slower but relentless pressure on prey. Alongside them came big cats, built for silence and sudden acceleration. Their bodies held coiled energy, muscles layered for explosive motion rather than distance. They used cover where it existed, approaching close before releasing a burst of speed. Claws gripped and pulled, teeth locked and held. This method brought the struggle to ground level, turning encounters into close contact contests, rather than brief aerial strikes. Even in open spaces, their flexibility allowed them to adapt, using terrain in ways birds could not. Bears and other large omnivorous predators followed, carrying mass and strength shaped for versatility. They were not dedicated hunters alone, but opportunists capable of shifting diet and behavior with changing conditions. Their size offered authority, and their intelligence supported memory of places and seasons. They could claim carcasses, compete directly when paths crossed, and persist through lean times by eating what others ignored. This adaptability added another layer of complexity to the predator landscape. Smaller mammal hunters filled the gaps between these giants. Agile carnivores chased what slipped past larger forms, and scavengers followed movement across the plains. Together, they formed a network rather than a single dominant presence. Each species brought its own timing, strengths, and tolerances, creating overlapping pressures rather than a single shadow. For prey animals, this change altered the rhythm of survival. Movement that once avoided a single type of danger now faced many. Speed alone was no longer sufficient, nor was vigilance focused in one direction. Threats could arrive low or high, alone or in groups, sudden or drawn out. The land itself began to feel different as paths of escape multiplied and narrowed at the same time. For terror birds, the shift was subtle but profound. They were no longer the sole architects of fear. Their hunting grounds overlapped with competitors who operated on different schedules and scales. Prey became scarcer in predictable patterns. Opportunities narrowed at the margins. The efficiency that once ensured dominance now faced interference rather than absence. This moment did not bring immediate collapse. Life continued, and terror birds still ruled many encounters. Yet the arrival of mammal predators marked the beginning of shared space at the top of the food web. The continent moved from simplicity toward crowding, from isolation toward interaction. In that growing complexity, the balance that had held for so long began to tilt, almost imperceptibly, under the combined weight of many new hunters learning the shape of a land that had once belonged to one. The meeting of bird hunters and mammal hunters did not arrive with a single moment of confrontation. It unfolded as overlap, as shared ground where paths crossed more often than before. The plains, once shaped by a single dominant design, now carried the imprints of two very different approaches to survival. Tracks layered over tracks. Scents lingered where none had before. The land itself became a place of comparison, where strategies refined in isolation now existed side by side. Terror birds moved through this space with the authority of long familiarity. Their presence remained tall and upright, their attention carried forward rather than outward. They claimed visibility, relying on speed, precision, and decisive force. Their hunt still ended quickly, when conditions aligned, the strike from above concluding what pursuit had begun. This method favored clarity and control, minimizing struggle and conserving effort. For ages, it had been enough. Mammal hunters arrived carrying a different rhythm. Wolves read the landscape through traces left behind, following paths that extended beyond sight. Big cats slipped between moments, waiting for angles rather than distance. Bears pressed their weight into the ground, confident in strength and adaptability. Their bodies worked close to the earth, low and grounded, turning encounters into contests of endurance, leverage, and persistence. Where birds ended hunts with speed, mammals extended them through pressure. These differences shaped how each predator met prey and how they met one another. Mammals could exploit moments after a bird's strike, claiming remains through presence or numbers. Birds could arrive first to movement, ending opportunities before mammals could act. Neither style canceled the other, but each interfered with the certainty that once defined the hunt. Success became less predictable, not because either was inferior, but because the landscape now supported alternatives. At shared boundaries, subtle conflicts emerged without drama. Carcasses shifted owners. Prey altered patterns more frequently. Timing mattered more than before. A missed strike or delayed pursuit carried heavier consequences in a crowded field. The margin for error narrowed as efficiency faced interruption. Over time, even small losses accumulated into meaningful change. The contrast between killing styles extended beyond the moment of contact. Terror birds depended on open ground and clear lines, on the ability to commit fully and finish quickly. Mammals thrived in variability, adapting to terrain, cover, and cooperation. One approach favored specialization refined to near perfection. The other favored flexibility, spreading risk across behavior and group dynamics. In isolation, each worked beautifully. Together, they tested the limits of one another. For prey, this collision intensified pressure. Movement patterns refined under one ruler now faced many. Escape routes that avoided one threat led toward another. Stillness could betray scent. Speed could draw pursuit. Survival became a constant adjustment rather than a learned script. The ecosystem grew louder with signals, denser with consequences, and more complex in its demands. Within this shared space, the terror birds remained formidable, but their role subtly changed. They were no longer the single reference point around which life revolved. Their dominance had to be asserted repeatedly rather than assumed. Energy spent defending opportunity could not be spent refining the hunt. Over time, this shift mattered more than any single encounter. The collision of these two predator worlds did not bring immediate collapse or dramatic scenes of defeat. It brought overlap, pressure, and gradual redistribution of advantage. The land absorbed these changes quietly, recording them not in spectacle, but in altered movement, reduced certainty, and a growing sense that the old balance was giving way to a new and more crowded order. As predator worlds overlapped, the struggle for prey unfolded without spectacle. There were no grand confrontations etched into the land, no single moment where one hunter replaced another. Instead, competition settled in quietly, expressed through timing, scarcity, and small repeated losses. When multiple predators relied on the same animals to survive, every successful hunt by one reduced opportunity for another, the landscape began to feel tighter, its margins less forgiving than before. Prey species responded first, adjusting movement and behavior in subtle ways. Herds shifted routes more often, no longer settling into predictable paths. Feeding grounds were abandoned earlier, and pauses shortened. Animals that once escaped a single threat now faced layered pressure from above and below, from speed and from persistence. Even when prey survived an encounter, the effort left them weakened, altering future outcomes in ways that rippled outward through the system. For predators, this shared reliance reshaped daily life. Hunts that once ended in certainty became increasingly contested. A chase might scatter prey toward another hunter's range. A successful kill could attract attention before it was fully claimed. Energy spent pursuing did not always return as nourishment. Over time, this imbalance mattered deeply. Predators survive not on occasional success, but on consistency, and competition erodes that steadiness first. The strongest species are often the most vulnerable to this kind of pressure. Large bodies demand large returns, and specialized hunters depend on specific conditions aligning. When those conditions become crowded, efficiency declines. Terror birds, refined for open space and quick resolution, faced interference that their design did not anticipate. Each missed opportunity carried a cost that could not always be recovered through flexibility or diet change. Mammal predators felt these pressures as well, but their varied strategies softened the impact. Group hunting could compensate for failed attempts. Opportunism allowed shifts toward different food sources. Even so, competition thinned populations across the board, not through direct violence, but through reduced margins for error. Survival became less about dominance and more about endurance within a crowded field. This silent war left few obvious traces. Fossils do not record missed hunts or abandoned carcasses. They do not capture exhaustion or the slow decline of success rates. Yet these invisible factors shape extinction more reliably than catastrophe. When enough individuals fail to reproduce or raise young, populations contract quietly, range shrinks, strongholds become isolated. The process feels gradual within a lifetime, but decisive across generations. Competition also alters relationships between predator and environment. Overhunting pressure can reduce prey numbers below levels that sustain large hunters. As prey grows scarce, predators range farther, spend more energy, and risk injury more often. Each step amplifies vulnerability. For species built around efficiency, this spiral tightens quickly. In such conditions, being the strongest hunter offers no guarantee of persistence. Strength must be matched with adaptability and specialization with flexibility. When the balance tips toward crowding, even long successful designs can falter. The land does not choose winners through conflict alone. It responds to pressures by reshaping what remains possible. The silent war for prey did not end the terror birds in a single stroke. It wore at them patiently, eroding the stability that had supported their reign. In this quiet contest, competition proved more decisive than any rival strike, demonstrating that in nature, survival is often decided not by who kills best, but by who can endure change longest. As mammal predators settled into the shared landscape, subtle advantages began to matter more than size or presence alone. Their success did not come from a single trait, but from a combination of tools that worked together across many situations. Teeth played a central role. Unlike beaks designed for striking, mammalian teeth offered variety within one mouth. Sharp canines punctured and held, while molars sliced or crushed. This flexibility allowed mammals to process prey more completely and efficiently, extracting nourishment even from parts others left behind. Feeding could continue long after a hunt ended, supporting bodies through lean stretches when opportunities were rare. Brains added another layer of resilience. Mammal predators carried proportionally larger and more complex neural structures, supporting memory, learning, and adjustment. Individuals remembered routes, seasons, and patterns of prey movement. They learned from failed attempts as much as from success, refining strategies rather than repeating the same approach unchanged. Over time, this capacity allowed populations to adapt behavior faster than bodies needed to evolve, responding to shifting conditions with subtle changes in timing and method. Group hunting amplified these cognitive strengths. Wolves and other social predators did not rely on a single individual's speed or precision. Instead, they coordinated through movement and sound, surrounding prey or pressing it toward exhaustion. Each member played a role, and failure did not rest on one body alone. This cooperation reduced risk and increased consistency. A missed bite or stumble mattered less when others could compensate, turning uncertainty into shared effort. Endurance completed the picture. Mammals regulated body temperature internally, allowing sustained activity over long distances and varied conditions. They could travel through heat and cold with less dependence on ambient warmth. During chases, this endurance translated into persistence rather than bursts. Prey that escaped an initial rush still faced pressure, step after step, as fatigue accumulated. Over time, this method proved reliable in crowded ecosystems where quick resolution was no longer guaranteed. These traits worked together quietly, reinforcing one another without spectacle. Teeth supported flexible diets, which reduced dependence on perfect hunts. Brains enabled learning, which improved efficiency over a lifetime. Groups shared risk, spreading survival across many individuals. Endurance filled the gaps when speed or strength fell short. None of these qualities alone ensured dominance, but together they formed a design well suited to competition and change. In contrast, terror birds remained highly specialized. Their strength lay in decisive speed and precision, honed within a stable system that rewarded those traits. When conditions were clear, they were unmatched. When conditions grew crowded and unpredictable, their margin narrowed. Adaptation through behavior had limits without the support of cooperation or dietary flexibility. Each challenge demanded more effort from the same design, rather than inviting new solutions. The advantage of mammals did not reveal itself in dramatic encounters. It appeared gradually, measured in small successes repeated often enough to matter. Populations held steady where others thinned. Territories expanded incrementally. Young survived slightly more often. These differences accumulated quietly, generation after generation, shaping the future without announcing themselves in any single moment. In this shared world, mammals did not overthrow their rivals through force alone. They endured. Their bodies and minds absorbed variability and turned it into opportunity. As the landscape continued to change, this capacity became increasingly valuable. The Earth favors designs that bend rather than hold rigidly, especially when boundaries dissolve and pressures multiply. Through teeth that processed more, brains that learned faster, groups that shared burden, and endurance that carried them farther, mammals held an advantage suited not for a single world, but for many. As pressure continued to build, the presence of terror birds across the land began to thin in ways that were easy to overlook. They did not vanish from sight all at once. Instead, their range slowly contracted, retreating from the edges of territory they once crossed freely. Areas that had long supported their hunts grew quieter, not because prey had disappeared entirely, but because certainty had. The open plains still stretched wide, yet fewer of those spaces offered the conditions these birds needed to hunt efficiently and without interruption. Hunting territory depends not only on space, but on reliability. Terror birds required ground where speed could unfold fully and where prey movement followed familiar patterns. As mammal predators occupied more regions, these conditions became uneven. Some areas grew crowded with overlapping paths, scents, and disturbances. Others shifted under changing prey behavior, becoming unpredictable in timing and movement. Gradually, terror birds favored smaller core regions where their methods still worked best, leaving once suitable land unused. This contraction carried subtle consequences. Smaller territories supported fewer individuals. Encounters between birds became more frequent, not as cooperation, but as quiet competition among their own kind. Juveniles faced greater difficulty establishing ranges of their own. Each generation inherited a world slightly more constrained than the last, shaped by boundaries that had not existed before. At the same time, the success rate of hunts began to slip. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm an observer within a single season, but steadily enough to matter across years. Prey animals were harder to corner and quicker to divert toward other dangers. Interruptions became more common. A chase ended abruptly as prey crossed into the range of a different predator. A successful strike drew unwanted attention before feeding could be completed. Energy spent no longer returned as nourishment as reliably as it once had. For a hunter built around efficiency, these losses accumulated quietly. Terror birds did not have wide dietary flexibility. Each failed hunt represented more than hunger. It reduced time available to rest, to guard territory, or to raise young. Recovery demanded additional effort, placing greater strain on bodies already tuned for precision rather than endurance. Reproduction felt these pressures most keenly. Fewer successful hunts meant fewer reserves for egg laying and care. Nesting sites became harder to defend as territory boundaries compressed. Young that survived faced a landscape where opportunities to learn successful hunting were limited. Skills honed over generations now encountered obstacles that practice alone could not solve. The land recorded these changes without ceremony. Tracks became less frequent in places once crossed daily. Bones appeared in the fossil record farther apart, not because the birds had changed form, but because they were fewer. Their presence remained impressive where it endured, yet it no longer defined the entire system. The shadow they cast over the ecosystem shortened. This loss of ground was not the result of weakness or sudden failure. It reflected a mismatch between a specialized design and a shifting environment. Terror birds remained powerful within their narrowed range. Their strikes were still lethal when they connected, but power without opportunity cannot sustain abundance. Over time, the gap between what they could do and where they could do it widened. As generations passed, the contraction continued. What had once been a continent shaped by a single dominant hunter became a mosaic of influences. Terror birds persisted, but they no longer set the tone everywhere they walked. Their reign entered a quieter phase, marked not by defeat, but by retreat, as the landscape slowly made less room for a design that had once fit it perfectly. As competition tightened the margins of survival, the climate began to shift in ways that further unsettled the land. These changes did not arrive as a single cold sweep or sudden drought. They emerged gradually, layered over centuries, altering temperature, rainfall, and seasonality until familiar patterns loosened. Ice ages advanced and retreated across the planet, their influence reaching far beyond the ice itself. Even in regions untouched by glaciers, air cooled, winds strengthened, and growing seasons shortened or stretched in unfamiliar ways. Grasslands responded first. Some expanded under cooler, drier conditions, while others thinned and fragmented as moisture patterns changed. Once continuous plains broke into patches separated by scrub and open soil. Water sources shifted their courses or became seasonal. Rivers that had run steadily slowed or braided, and shallow wetlands dried earlier each year. These changes did not erase habitat, but they reshaped it, favoring flexibility over specialization. For terror birds, these alterations reduced the reliability of open ground. Hunting depended on clear sightlines and predictable movement. As vegetation patterns changed, prey no longer followed the same routes or gathered in the same numbers. Some species retreated toward remaining water, others adapted to more varied terrain, and some declined entirely. Each shift altered the availability of targets that terror birds had relied on for generations. Ice Age cycles also brought cooler temperatures that influenced physiology and behavior. Birds, though warm-blooded, are more exposed to environmental extremes through surface area and activity patterns. Extended cold reduced the efficiency of long pursuits and increased the energy cost of daily movement. Frost and seasonal chill limited prey activity at certain times, compressing hunting windows. What had once been a steady rhythm became fragmented, demanding more effort for fewer returns. Drying trends added further strain. In regions where rainfall declined, vegetation grew tougher and more sparse. Grazing herds adjusted their ranges, traveling farther between feeding grounds. These longer distances scattered prey rather than concentrating it, reducing the chances of quick detection and pursuit. For predators dependent on speed and surprise over open ground, dispersed targets meant longer searches and greater fatigue. Mammal hunters met these challenges with a wider range of responses. Fur provided insulation against cold. Varied diets allowed shifts toward different prey or scavenging during lean periods. Group behavior made it easier to exploit changing conditions, sharing knowledge of where resources remained. Terror birds lacked many of these buffers. Their design favored specific conditions, and as those conditions fluctuated more frequently, the cost of specialization increased. Changing prey populations amplified the effect. Some animals adapted quickly to cooler or drier climates, altering size, movement, or social structure. Others declined or disappeared from certain regions entirely. Each loss reverberated upward. Terror birds did not easily replace one type of prey with another. When familiar species became scarce, hunting efficiency dropped further, regardless of skill or strength. These environmental pressures did not operate alone. They stacked upon competition and territorial contraction, tightening the space in which terror birds could function effectively. A missed hunt carried greater weight when cold demanded more energy. A shrinking territory felt more severe when water and prey were unevenly distributed. Climate turned existing challenges into persistent obstacles. The land continued to change without regard for who depended on it. Seasons blurred and sharpened in cycles that exceeded any single lifetime. Over generations, these shifts nudged ecosystems toward forms better suited to variability and endurance. For terror birds, the climate did not act as an executioner, but as an unyielding current, gradually carrying the world away from the conditions that had once allowed them to thrive so completely. As pressures layered over one another, the ecosystem began to lose its former coherence. Changes that had once been absorbed quietly now intersected, creating gaps where balance had lived. Food chains, which depend on steady transfer of energy from plants to herbivores to predators, grew uneven. When one link weakened, the effects traveled outward, not as a sudden break, but as a gradual thinning of connections that had once felt secure. Prey populations fluctuated more sharply. Some animals declined under combined stress from new predators and shifting climate, while others surged briefly before exhausting available resources. These uneven patterns disrupted the timing that predators relied upon. A season that once brought abundance now arrived late or not at all. Energy moved through the system in irregular pulses rather than steady flow, making survival increasingly dependent on chance rather than rhythm. Smaller species felt these changes first and most deeply. Creatures with limited ranges or specialized diets had little room to adjust. As vegetation patterns shifted and grazing pressure changed, the plants they depended on grew scarce. Insects followed their hosts into decline, and the animals that fed on those insects followed in turn. Each disappearance removed another thread, thinning the fabric of life without dramatic notice. The loss of small species carried outsized consequences. They pollinated plants, turned soil, and recycled nutrients. When their numbers fell, these quiet services faded. Seeds traveled less widely. Decomposition slowed or sped unevenly. The ground itself changed character, becoming either compacted or eroded depending on what was missing. These alterations fed back into plant communities, reinforcing instability rather than easing it. Predators at higher levels felt the effects indirectly at first. Fewer small animals meant fewer medium sized prey, which meant less consistent nourishment for larger hunters. Even species that did not hunt the same animals directly became connected through absence. Competition intensified not only because of rival predators, but because the overall pool of life grew less reliable. The ecosystem no longer responded as a unified whole. Instead, it fractured into pockets of temporary abundance surrounded by stretches of scarcity. Movement increased as animals searched for what no longer appeared predictably. This constant redistribution carried energy away from reproduction and growth, further reducing resilience. Young animals faced greater odds, not from direct threat alone, but from weakened conditions into which they were born. Terror birds were both contributors to and casualties of this unraveling. Their hunting shaped prey numbers, yet they depended on the very stability that was slipping away. As smaller species vanished, the broader structure that supported larger prey faltered. The birds remained powerful within encounters, but encounters themselves became less frequent, set against a background of diminishing support. What emerged was not immediate collapse, but fragility. Systems once buffered against change now reacted sharply to minor shifts. A dry season carried farther. A cold spell lingered longer. Recovery slowed. Each loss made the next more likely as redundancy disappeared and alternatives narrowed. The breaking of an ecosystem is rarely loud. It unfolds through quiet absences, through familiar presences that no longer return. Over time, the landscape that remains can still look full, still carry movement and life, yet it lacks the deep interconnection that once sustained it. In this way, the world under the terror birds began to hollow, not through a single catastrophe, but through the steady erosion of the small lives that held everything else together. As the ecosystem thinned, the presence of terror birds grew less common, not suddenly, but in a way that only becomes clear when looking back across long spans of time. Fossils begin to tell this story quietly. Where their bones once appeared regularly across broad regions, they now surfaced less often, separated by greater distances and longer intervals. The record does not show a dramatic fall, but a steady fading, as if the land itself were slowly forgetting how often these birds had walked across it. Earlier layers preserve a diversity of forms, skulls and limbs that vary subtly in size and proportion, evidence of many species sharing the same world. In later layers, that variety narrows. Fewer shapes appear. Differences that once marked distinct lineages soften or vanish entirely. What remains are echoes of what had been, isolated representatives rather than a thriving family. Diversity, once one of their quiet strengths, diminished alongside opportunity. This reduction in species reflects more than chance. Each lineage depended on a particular balance of prey, space, and stability. As those conditions fractured, only the most adaptable forms persisted, and even they did so within tighter boundaries. Specialized species, tied closely to certain habitats or hunting conditions, disappeared first. Their absence further simplified the predator community, leaving fewer paths for survival within the same design. Geography tells a similar story. The range of terror birds contracted into pockets rather than sweeping expanses. Fossils that once appeared across wide stretches of the continent became confined to specific regions, often those that retained open ground and relatively stable prey populations. These refuges functioned as last strongholds, places where older patterns held on a little longer. Outside them, the birds grew scarce enough to leave no consistent trace. Smaller ranges brought their own risks. Isolated populations faced greater vulnerability to local change. A single prolonged drought, a shift in prey migration, or increased competition could erase a group entirely. Without neighboring populations to replenish numbers, loss became permanent. Each disappearance reduced the chance of recovery elsewhere, tightening the spiral. The rarity of terror birds did not mean they lost their presence entirely. Where they remained, they were still imposing, still capable hunters within their shrinking world. Yet rarity changes how a species interacts with its environment. Encounters became infrequent, influence diminished. The patterns of fear and movement that once rippled outward from their activity softened as other pressures took precedence. Fossil gaps reflect this reduced influence. Fewer tracks appear, fewer bones accumulate. The silence between findings grows longer. These absences are not evidence of sudden catastrophe, but of populations thinning below the level where they leave frequent marks in the ground. The earth records abundance clearly, but it records scarcity as quiet. Over generations, the terror birds became something the land no longer expected. Their presence shifted from defining to incidental. Other predators filled more of the available space, shaping prey behavior and movement. The birds persisted on the margins, their design unchanged, their context transformed. This stage marks a profound turning point, not the end, but the narrowing of possibility. A lineage that once ruled a continent now existed as scattered remnants, each tied to landscapes growing less favorable with time. In the long story written in stone, this is where dominance gives way to persistence alone, and persistence begins to fail under the weight of isolation, reduced diversity, and a world that no longer makes room for what once seemed unshakable. As their presence dwindled across much of the continent, terror birds did not disappear everywhere at once. They lingered longest in particular places, landscapes that still resembled the world in which their design had once flourished. These final strongholds were not hidden refuges in the sense of shelter, but regions where open space, prey behavior, and climate combined in ways that continued to favor speed and decisive force. Broad grasslands with limited tree cover remained especially important. In these areas, long sight lines allowed early detection of movement, and firm ground supported sustained running. Prey species that persisted there tended to move in visible groups, maintaining patterns that terror birds understood well. Where vegetation stayed low and seasonal changes were less extreme, the birds could still impose order through presence and precision. These places preserved fragments of an older balance. Certain coastal plains also offered prolonged refuge. Winds coming off the ocean moderated temperature swings, softening the extremes brought by advancing ice ages. Rainfall patterns remained more reliable, sustaining grasslands and grazing animals even as inland regions dried or fractured. Here, prey did not scatter as widely, and water sources stayed within reach. The stability of these margins slowed the pace of ecological change just enough to give the birds more time. Isolation played a quiet role as well. Regions that were harder for new mammal predators to reach or thrive in experienced less intense competition. Narrow corridors, poor soils, or fluctuating resources limited the spread of some rivals. In these spaces, terror birds faced fewer interruptions during hunts and fewer challenges to their established routines. The absence of constant pressure allowed their populations to persist even as numbers elsewhere declined. These strongholds delayed the end by reducing the number of simultaneous stresses. Competition remained, but it was uneven. Climate shifts still occurred, but their impact was softened. Prey populations fluctuated, yet not as violently. Each buffer mattered. Survival depends not on avoiding change entirely, but on encountering it slowly enough to absorb its effects. In these regions, the pace of change stayed just below the threshold that would have overwhelmed the birds. Within these last domains, terror birds continued much as they always had. Their movements traced familiar paths, their strikes remained effective, their presence still shaped behavior beneath them. Yet even here, signs of strain accumulated quietly. Populations were smaller and more isolated. Breeding opportunities were limited by space rather than abundance. Genetic diversity narrowed as fewer individuals contributed to each generation. Over time, the protective qualities of these landscapes weakened. Competitors eventually arrived, or conditions shifted further. Grasslands fragmented, prey adapted, or moved on. What had delayed the end could not prevent it indefinitely. The strongholds functioned like eddies in a river, pockets where flow slowed while the larger current continued forward. The fossil record preserves this pattern clearly. The last appearances of terror birds cluster in these marginal regions, appearing later than elsewhere, yet still separated by widening gaps. Each occurrence marks not a resurgence, but a final echo. The land held onto them as long as it could, offering familiar ground and softened change, but even the most forgiving places could not remain unchanged forever. In these last strongholds, the terror birds did not fall in dramatic fashion. They persisted quietly, carrying forward a design that no longer fit the broader world. Their survival there reminds us that extinction is often uneven, shaped by geography as much as biology. Some places let the past linger longer, allowing ancient rulers a final span of time before the earth, patient and unyielding, moved fully beyond them. By the time the final generations of terror birds walked the land, the world they inherited was already diminished. It still carried familiar shapes, open horizons, wind across grass, the long memory of a reign that had once felt unbreakable. Yet beneath that surface, the structure that supported them had grown thin. Their lives unfolded within landscapes that no longer buffered uncertainty, where each season asked more than the last. These last birds faced a convergence of challenges rather than a single overwhelming threat. Hunting required longer travel across fragmented territory. Prey appeared less often and behaved less predictably, shaped by pressures that pulled them in many directions at once. A successful strike no longer guaranteed nourishment, as competitors moved through the same spaces, sometimes arriving sooner, sometimes lingering after the birds had gone. Energy budgets tightened, and every choice carried greater weight. Raising young became especially difficult. Nesting sites were harder to defend within shrinking ranges. Reduced food availability meant fewer opportunities to invest in eggs and offspring. Chicks that survived the earliest days faced landscapes where learning the hunt was more complex than it had been for generations before them. Skills perfected under simpler conditions now encountered interference at every step. The margin between success and failure narrowed until experience alone could not compensate. The climate continued to shift around them, adding instability to an already fragile balance. Cooler periods compressed activity into shorter windows. Drier intervals scattered prey farther apart. Habitats that once offered consistency now fluctuated year to year, sometimes season to season. For animals built to excel within known patterns, this constant adjustment demanded more than their design easily supplied. Isolation deepened these pressures. Populations became separated into smaller groups with little contact between them. Genetic diversity declined as fewer individuals contributed to the next generation. This made adaptation slower just as conditions demanded faster response. Losses that might once have been absorbed became permanent. Each absence echoed more loudly than before. The ecosystem itself offered less support. Smaller species that had once sustained the broader food web were already rare or gone. Nutrient cycles faltered. Plant communities changed character, altering where prey could graze and hide. The terror birds were not just losing ground to rivals or climate, but to the gradual hollowing of the system beneath them. What remained was a framework that looked intact from a distance, yet lacked depth and resilience. Within this fragile world, the terror birds remained recognizable. Their bodies still carried the same balance and power, their strikes still precise when the moment allowed. They did not grow weaker in form or intent. What failed them was not their design, but the environment that no longer aligned with it. They were specialists, moving through a world that now rewarded generalists. The final generations lived without knowledge of what had been lost. They responded to the conditions they encountered, not to the memory of a continent shaped entirely around them. Each bird navigated a life made more precarious by forces beyond any single adaptation. Survival depended increasingly on chance, on the timing of encounters, on weather and competition aligning briefly in their favor. When these last birds disappeared, the event would leave little immediate trace. No grand collapse followed, because the structure had already been thinning for generations. Their absence simply completed a process long underway. The world they left behind continued to move, quieter and rearranged, carrying forward without the presence that had once defined it. In this way, the end of the terror birds was not a sudden fall, but the final step in a long narrowing where a lineage reached the edge of a world that had already grown too fragile to hold it. The end of the terror bird's reign did not arrive as a single dramatic event etched sharply into time. It emerged as a brief interval where pressures that had been building separately finally aligned. Scientists reading the fossil record see no sign of one sudden catastrophe, no evidence of disease or a solitary climatic blow. Instead, the moment their rule ended appears as a rapid convergence, a narrowing window where survival slipped beyond reach within only a few thousand years. By this point, terror birds existed only in scattered populations, each dependent on landscapes already under strain. When prey numbers dipped further, there were no surplus regions left to compensate. A poor season could no longer be balanced by abundance elsewhere. Competition from mammal predators reached even the last strongholds, not necessarily overwhelming in number, but persistent enough to claim opportunities that terror birds depended on. The margin that had once absorbed loss vanished. What scientists believe happened is rooted in this collapse of resilience. Terror birds did not gradually evolve into smaller forms or diversify into new roles. Their bodies remained largely the same until the end. The fossil record shows continuity of form paired with disappearance, suggesting that adaptation did not fail through slowness but through limits. Their design was optimized for a world that no longer existed. When that world receded beyond a certain point, persistence became impossible. The speed of their extinction reflects how close to the edge they already were. Once population numbers dropped below a critical threshold, recovery was no longer likely. Small groups meant fewer breeding pairs. Fewer breeding pairs meant fewer young. Losses compounded quickly. What might have taken hundreds of thousands of years in a robust system unfolded far faster in a fragile one. Climate variability played a final supporting role. Shorter favorable seasons reduced hunting windows at the same time that prey became harder to find. Each failed hunt mattered more than before. Each lost juvenile echoed through a population already stretched thin. Scientists note that when environmental stress and competition peak together, extinction can proceed with surprising speed, even for species that endured for millions of years. There is no evidence that terror birds were outmatched in direct confrontation. Their skulls and limbs show no sign of degeneration. They did not lose their ability to hunt in isolation. What they lost was access to consistent opportunity. Predators survive not by occasional success, but by reliable success across time. When reliability disappears, extinction can follow swiftly. In geological terms, their reign ended almost abruptly. Layers rich with their fossils give way to layers where they no longer appear. The transition is not gradual fading across vast spans, but a sharp boundary. The world adjusted quickly. Mammal predators expanded their ranges. Prey behavior shifted again. Ecosystems reorganized without pause. The moment the reign ends is therefore not a dramatic collapse, but a tipping point. A final alignment of shrinking territory, intense competition, climate stress, and ecological fragility pushed a long, successful lineage past recovery. Terror birds did not vanish because they were weak, slow, or outdated. They vanished because success had narrowed their path until there was nowhere left to step. In the calm after their disappearance, the land continued to move forward. The silence they left was not sudden, but it was complete. A reign that had shaped continents ended quietly, not with conflict, but with the simple truth that the world had changed faster than a specialized ruler could follow. The absence of terror birds after their disappearance is striking not because extinction itself is rare, but because no branch of their lineage managed to cross into the new world that followed. Many groups lose dominance yet persist in altered forms. Terror birds did not. Their failure to adapt was not the result of weakness or lack of time, but of a design shaped too precisely for conditions that no longer existed. Adaptation depends on variation. Species survive change when individuals differ enough for new traits to gain footing. By the final stages of their history, terror birds had lost much of that flexibility. Their populations were small and fragmented, their genetic diversity reduced by long isolation and repeated losses. With fewer individuals contributing to future generations, the raw material for change narrowed. Evolution slowed just as pressure accelerated. Their bodies also carried limits that could not be adjusted incrementally. Terror birds were highly specialized hunters, built for speed, open ground, and decisive strikes. Reducing size would not solve shrinking territory. Growing heavier would not help in competition with mammals. Shifting diet away from large prey would undermine the very structure of their skulls and necks. Small behavioral adjustments could no longer compensate for a design so tightly bound to a specific role. Reproduction amplified these constraints. Large birds with extended growth periods require stable conditions to replace themselves. Fewer eggs, longer care, and delayed maturity meant losses were slow to recover. In fluctuating environments, species with faster reproduction can rebound quickly. Terror birds could not. Each failed breeding season carved deeper into their remaining numbers, and recovery never caught up with decline. Competition sealed these vulnerabilities. Mammal predators did not merely challenge terror birds in hunts, they filled overlapping niches with greater flexibility, adapting diet, behavior, and cooperation as conditions shifted. This reduced the space available for any alternative predator strategy to persist. Terror birds faced not a single rival to overcome, but a crowded field that left no unused ecological role to move into. Climate instability removed the final buffer. As seasons grew less predictable, specialization became liability. Terror birds could not easily adjust activity patterns or shelter strategies. Their hunting success depended on consistency, and consistency vanished. A lineage adapted to narrow margins cannot survive when margins dissolve. Extinction, in this sense, was not dramatic or violent. It was unavoidable because every path forward closed at once. Adaptation requires time, diversity, and opportunity. Terror birds lost all three simultaneously. By the time pressures peaked, there was no gradual transition left to make. Persistence without change only delayed the inevitable. The fossil record reflects this clearly. There is no trail of intermediate forms, no evidence of diversification into new shapes or roles. The line ends cleanly, not because the birds failed suddenly, but because they had already reached the limit of what their form could sustain. When the final individuals died, they left no successors capable of carrying their legacy forward. In the end, terror birds did not survive because the world stopped rewarding what they were built to do. Their extinction was not punishment for dominance, but a consequence of precision. They were too well adapted to an environment that vanished beneath them. Evolution favors flexibility when worlds collide and climates shift. Terror birds had mastered one world perfectly, and perfection, when conditions change, leaves no room to bend. When the terror birds disappeared, the landscape did not remain empty for long. The absence they left behind was quickly filled by mammals already present and ready to expand. Predators that had once shared space cautiously now moved with confidence, extending their ranges into open ground that had been contested for generations. The transition did not feel abrupt to the land itself. It unfolded as a steady rearrangement, guided by opportunity rather than conquest. Large cats became prominent figures across the plains and woodlands. Their ability to stalk, ambush, and overpower prey allowed them to thrive in environments that had grown more fragmented and unpredictable. Where open grass once favored long pursuit, patchwork terrain favored silence and sudden acceleration. Cats adjusted easily to shifting prey routes and changing cover, shaping new patterns of fear and movement beneath them. Wolves and other social hunters followed similar paths of expansion. Their strength lay in cooperation and persistence, qualities well suited to ecosystems where prey was wary and dispersed. Working together, they could test herds, isolate weaker individuals, and adapt their tactics as conditions changed. Their presence spread widely, filling spaces that once belonged to solitary rulers with coordinated pressure that rarely depended on perfect conditions. Bears and versatile carnivores added further weight to this new order. Their broad diets allowed them to exploit resources beyond active hunting, from scavenging remains to consuming plants and insects when meat was scarce. This flexibility stabilized their populations across seasons and climates, anchoring predator roles in a world that no longer rewarded narrow specialization. Smaller mammalian predators multiplied as well, occupying niches that had once been limited by the terror bird's dominance. Foxes, mustelids, and other agile hunters shaped the lower levels of the food web, exerting pressure on small prey species and redistributing energy through new pathways. Predation became layered rather than singular, spreading influence across size classes and behaviors. As these mammals expanded, the balance of the ecosystem shifted from simplicity to complexity. No single predator defined the landscape everywhere. Instead, influence varied by region, season, and terrain. Prey species responded with a wider range of strategies, from grouping tightly to dispersing broadly, from increased vigilance to rapid reproduction. The system grew more dynamic, less predictable, and more resilient to localized change. Energy moved differently through this new world. Loss at one point could be absorbed elsewhere. When a predator declined in a region, another often filled the gap. This redundancy reduced the risk of sudden collapse, even as competition remained intense. The food web thickened, gaining depth through overlapping roles rather than relying on one dominant force. The land itself reflected this change. Paths multiplied instead of converging. Grazing pressure spread unevenly rather than forming clear zones of avoidance. Fear became diffuse, no longer centered on a single silhouette against the horizon. The quiet authority once exercised by terror birds gave way to constant adjustment, a landscape always responding rather than settling. This mammal dominated world did not erase the past entirely. The shapes of plains, forests, and prey bodies still carried echoes of earlier rulers, yet those echoes no longer guided daily life. The balance had shifted toward adaptability, cooperation, and endurance across variation. Success belonged to those who could share space, change tactics, and persist through uncertainty. In this way, the mammal world took over not through dramatic overthrow, but through alignment with a changing Earth. The planet favored designs that could bend, overlap, and recover. Where terror birds had mastered one version of the world, mammals thrived by navigating many. The land moved forward under this new order, carrying with it a quieter, more complex balance shaped by multiplicity rather than singular rule. After the terror birds vanished, the planet did not pause to acknowledge the change. The landscapes they once crossed continued to breathe under wind and sun, absorbing absence as easily as presence. Ecosystems reset with a quiet efficiency that feels startling only in hindsight. Within a relatively short span of geological time, patterns of movement, feeding, and growth reorganized around the predators that remained. What had been shaped by one dominant force adjusted to many smaller ones without hesitation. This resetting happened through ordinary processes repeated countless times. Plants grew into spaces grazed differently, prey species altered routes, grouping, and timing, responding to new pressures without retaining memory of the old. Predators expanded or contracted their ranges, settling into balances that reflected current conditions rather than past ones. Each change reinforced the next, smoothing the transition until the previous order left little trace in daily function. Food webs are especially quick to rewrite themselves when opportunity opens. With the terror birds gone, energy that once flowed through a narrow channel dispersed across many. Mammal predators redistributed pressure across prey populations, preventing any single dynamic from dominating too completely. Smaller hunters filled lower levels, and scavengers closed gaps that had once been tightly controlled. The system grew denser, more layered, and more flexible, better able to absorb local loss without unraveling entirely. Because these changes occur incrementally, they rarely feel dramatic. No single generation experiences the full shift. Animals born into the new balance accept it as normal, unaware that the land was once ruled differently. Each generation inherits a world that feels complete in itself. In this way, forgetting is built into ecological time. Memory is not preserved unless conditions demand it. Fossils are the exception, storing snapshots of former dominance long after it ends. Yet fossils are hidden, scattered, and silent. They require deliberate attention to read. On the surface, the land offers few clues. Plains remain plains, forests remain forests. New rulers leave tracks where old ones once walked, and over time, those tracks fade into the same soil. Humans rarely notice these resets because they unfold far beyond the scale of individual lives. Change measured over thousands or millions of years registers as permanence to those living within it. We see continuity where there has been replacement, stability where there has been rearrangement. Even when extinction is recent by geological standards, ecosystems often appear settled by the time we arrive to observe them. There is also a tendency to focus on what remains rather than what is missing. Mammals, birds, and plants fill the world with activity, drawing attention to current abundance. Absence requires comparison, and comparison requires knowledge of the past. Without that context, the silence left by lost rulers goes unheard. In forgetting, the planet reveals a neutral resilience. Life does not honor previous hierarchies. It responds to conditions and opportunity, adjusting shape and behavior to what is possible now. The disappearance of terror birds did not diminish the richness of life, but it did change its character. Complexity replaced singular dominance, adaptability replaced precision, multiplicity replaced rule. A planet that forgets its old rulers is not careless. It is simply dynamic. Its memory is written in stone rather than experience, in layers rather than stories. To notice what has been lost requires slowing down and listening across time beyond what the present shows us. Only then does the quiet truth emerge that many worlds have existed before this one, complete in themselves, and many have been reshaped so thoroughly that their former masters survive only as faint impressions beneath our feet. The extinction of the terror birds offers science a quiet lesson written across deep time, one that reaches far beyond a single group of animals. It shows that dominance is not a fixed state, even when it lasts for millions of years. Power in nature emerges from alignment between form, environment, and opportunity. When those elements match, a species can seem unstoppable. When they drift apart, even the most successful rulers begin to fade. Dominance endures only while the world continues to reward the traits that created it. Terror birds thrived because their bodies, behavior, and surroundings fit together with unusual precision. Open land favored speed and visibility. Isolated ecosystems limited competition. Prey responded predictably. For a long time, these conditions reinforced one another. Science sees in this a reminder that success is contextual, dependent on circumstances rather than inherent superiority. When conditions change, dominance must either transform or give way. Evolution does not protect what once worked, only what works now. Terror birds illustrate how specialization can magnify success while quietly narrowing future options. Their precision allowed mastery, but it also reduced flexibility. As environments became more variable and competition intensified, there was little room left to adjust. The same traits that secured their reign limited their response. This pattern appears repeatedly in the fossil record. Apex predators often rise quickly when opportunity opens and persist while balance holds. Their fall rarely comes from a single rival or event. It comes from accumulated pressures that erode reliability. Science learns from this that extinction is often a process, not a moment, driven by thresholds rather than catastrophes. The story also demonstrates why no predator is ever safe, regardless of strength. Large hunters sit at the end of long chains of energy transfer. They depend on many layers beneath them remaining intact. When prey shifts, climates fluctuate, or competitors arrive, the effects travel upward. Apex predators feel those changes last, but most intensely. Their position grants influence, but it also brings vulnerability. Predators that dominate too completely can shape ecosystems in ways that bind them tightly to one version of the world. When that world shifts, there is no reserve strategy waiting. Science recognizes this as a recurring risk. Stability can disguise fragility, especially when change unfolds slowly enough to go unnoticed until recovery is no longer possible. The extinction of terror birds further teaches that resilience lies less in strength than in adaptability. Mammal predators that replaced them succeeded not because they were superior hunters in every encounter, but because they tolerated variability better. Their diets were broader, their behaviors were flexible, their social structures absorbed loss. These qualities allowed persistence across uncertainty, even if they never achieved singular dominance. From a scientific perspective, this reframes how success is measured. Longevity alone does not guarantee future survival. What matters is the capacity to respond when familiar patterns dissolve. Species that can bend without breaking often outlast those that rule decisively but rigidly. The lesson extends beyond predators. Ecosystems, like species, rely on balance rather than permanence. When balance shifts, the system reorganizes, often quickly and quietly. Science learns to look for warning signs, not in dramatic conflict, but in narrowing margins, reduced diversity, and increasing dependence on specific conditions. In the end, the terror birds remind us that Earth does not preserve hierarchies. It preserves motion, variation, and response. Dominance passes, replaced by new arrangements, shaped by chance and change. No predator, no matter how powerful, stands outside this rule. Survival belongs not to those who conquer a world completely, but to those who remain capable of living in the next one. The fall of the terror birds fits into a much older pattern, one that has repeated quietly across Earth's history. Long before their reign began, other rulers rose to similar heights, shaped ecosystems around themselves, and then vanished when the conditions that favored them slipped away. Science recognizes these parallels, not as coincidence, but as reminders that dominance follows rules that apply to every lineage, no matter how successful. Dinosaurs once embodied this pattern on a planetary scale. For tens of millions of years, large predatory dinosaurs occupied the highest tiers of land ecosystems, refining bodies built for power, reach, and efficiency. Their dominance shaped prey, vegetation, and movement across entire continents. Yet their success was bound to specific climates, food webs, and atmospheric conditions. When those conditions shifted rapidly at the end of the Cretaceous, size and specialization became liabilities. The fossil record shows not a long retreat, but a boundary where even the most established rulers could not persist beyond a sudden narrowing of possibility. Saber-toothed cats offer a more recent echo. These mammals perfected a hunting strategy centered on massive canines and powerful necks, allowing them to dispatch large prey with precision. For a time, this design worked exceptionally well, especially in ecosystems rich with megafauna. As climates fluctuated and large prey declined, the same specialization that once ensured success limited alternatives. Saber-toothed cats could not easily shift to smaller, more agile prey without compromising their core anatomy. Their extinction followed the familiar pattern, not sudden weakness, but a mismatch between form and a changing world. Ancient sharks tell a similar story beneath the surface of the oceans. Some lineages grew immense, occupying top predator roles for millions of years. Their bodies were tuned for specific hunting depths, temperatures, and prey types. As ocean currents shifted and marine ecosystems reorganized, many of these sharks declined. Smaller, more adaptable species persisted, while specialized giants faded. The seas did not empty of predators, They simply rearranged which designs remained viable. What connects these rulers is not a shared cause of extinction, but a shared structure of success. Each thrived by becoming extremely good at one way of life. Each benefited from long periods of environmental stability. Each shaped the evolution of other species around them, and each eventually encountered conditions that changed faster than their designs could adjust. Science learns from these cases that extinction often follows prolonged success rather than failure. Lineages that dominate for long spans tend to refine themselves tightly around prevailing conditions. This refinement magnifies efficiency but narrows tolerance. When change arrives gradually, such species can persist. When change accelerates or multiplies, flexibility matters more than mastery. These fallen rulers also show why extinction rarely announces itself as catastrophe from within the lineage. Dinosaurs did not grow weaker before disappearing. Saber-toothed cats did not lose their hunting skill. Ancient sharks did not forget how to patrol their waters. What failed was not the organism, but the fit between organism and environment. The world moved, and some designs could not follow. Seen together, these stories soften the idea of progress as a straight line. Evolution does not reward dominance forever, it rewards responsiveness in the moment. Ecosystems shift, climates oscillate, and continents rearrange. Rulers rise when conditions align, and they fall when those alignments dissolve. The terror birds now sit among these earlier rulers, part of a long procession rather than an isolated mystery. Their bones join layers already marked by vanished giants and forgotten hunters. In studying them together, science gains perspective, seeing extinction not as an ending imposed from outside, but as a transition written into the moving fabric of Earth itself. Across Earth's history, apex predators appear and vanish with remarkable regularity. Their stories differ in detail, yet the pattern remains consistent. Size brings power, but it also carries costs that accumulate quietly over time. Big bodies demand big needs, and those needs leave little room for error when the world begins to change. Large predators sit at the end of long energy chains. Every step below them must function smoothly for their lives to remain possible. Plants must grow in the right places. Herbivores must thrive in sufficient numbers. Smaller predators must not disrupt balance too severely. When any part of this structure weakens, the effects travel upward, concentrating pressure where margins are already thin. Apex predators feel scarcity before others because their survival depends on abundance elsewhere. Big bodies amplify this vulnerability. Large size requires more food, more territory, and more consistent access to resources. A missed hunt is not a minor inconvenience. It is a meaningful loss of energy that must be recovered quickly. For smaller animals, shortfalls can be absorbed. For giants, they accumulate. Over time, even slight reductions in prey or habitat can tip the balance from stability to decline. These needs also slow response. Large predators tend to reproduce more slowly, producing fewer offspring over longer periods. This strategy works well in stable environments where survival is predictable. When conditions fluctuate, it becomes a disadvantage. Losses take longer to replace. Populations cannot rebound quickly from bad seasons or sudden competition. Recovery lags behind change. Territory adds another layer of constraint. Apex predators require wide ranges to meet their needs, which ties them closely to landscape structure. Fragmentation reduces effective space even if land area remains similar. Boundaries multiply, corridors close. What once supported one individual now supports none. The animal remains capable, but the land no longer accommodates its scale. Big needs create small margins for error. When resources decline slightly, the effect on apex predators is disproportionately large. When competition increases modestly, the cost multiplies. When climate shifts shorten favorable seasons, the window for success narrows. Each pressure alone may be survivable. Together, they leave no buffer. This is why apex predators often persist for long periods and then disappear relatively quickly. Their decline begins invisibly, masked by strength and experience. Individuals continue to hunt successfully even as populations shrink. The system appears stable until it crosses a threshold where recovery is no longer possible. At that point, extinction can follow swiftly. Importantly, disappearance does not imply failure. Apex predators excel within specific conditions. They are specialists in dominance, not in adaptation to rapid change. Evolution allows them to rise when opportunity aligns, but it does not guarantee permanence. As environments shift, the traits that once conferred advantage can become burdens. Smaller, more flexible predators often replace them, not because they are stronger, but because they tolerate variation better. They require less energy, reproduce faster, and exploit a wider range of resources. Their margins for error are larger. They bend rather than break as conditions fluctuate. Science sees this pattern repeated across land and sea. From giant reptiles to massive cats to enormous sharks, apex predators rise to rule and then fade as circumstances move beyond their limits. Their extinction reshapes ecosystems, redistributing energy and opening space for new arrangements. The cycle continues without pause. In this light, apex predators are not anomalies destined to fail, but participants in a repeating rhythm. Big bodies bring influence, big needs bring risk. Small margins demand stability that Earth rarely maintains forever. Their disappearance is not a flaw in evolution, but a reflection of how tightly success is bound to balance and how fragile balance becomes at the very top. Long after the last terror birds vanished from the living world, their presence remained beneath the surface. It rested quietly in stone, embedded in sediment laid down by rivers, wind, and time. Fossils became the final witnesses, not dramatic monuments, but fragments scattered across ancient layers, waiting without urgency to be noticed. These remains are often incomplete. A heavy skull pressed flat by pressure, a leg bone worn smooth at the edges, a curve of beak locked in rock. Rarely do they appear as full skeletons. Instead, they arrive as suggestions, parts of bodies that once moved through open air and tall grass. Each piece preserves a moment where flesh became memory, where motion surrendered to stillness. What remains is enough. From these fragments, scientists trace outlines of muscle, balance, and motion. The thickness of bone reveals stresses carried during life. Joint surfaces show patterns of repeated use. Growth rings speak of seasons past and hardships endured. Even in silence, the bones retain information, stored patiently through millions of years of burial. Fossils do not capture behavior directly, yet they hint at it through absence and abundance. The distribution of remains across landscapes shows where terror birds once walked most often. The lack of bones in certain regions suggests barriers, climates, or competitors that shaped their limits. Clusters of fossils imply long residence. Gaps suggest withdrawal and retreat. The ground records not only presence, but pattern. What is missing from the record matters as much as what is preserved. There are no fossils that show terror birds shrinking into new forms, no gradual blending into smaller, different hunters. The line ends without branching. That silence speaks clearly. It tells of a lineage that did not transform its role, but held to it until the end. The ground keeps that truth without embellishment. These fossils whisper about worlds that felt complete to the creatures living in them. The bones reflect confidence in design, not struggle toward change. They show bodies built for certainty, for environments where patterns held long enough to be trusted. In this way, the remains capture not only anatomy, but assumption, the quiet expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. Over time, sediments buried these bones deeper, layering new worlds above old ones. Forests grew where grasslands had spread, rivers shifted courses, mountains rose far away. The terror bird's remains moved slowly downward, carried by gravity into deeper memory. Above them, life reorganized repeatedly, unaware of the shapes below. When uncovered, these fossils do not announce themselves loudly. They emerge through careful attention, through patience and comparison. Their value lies not in spectacle, but in continuity. They connect present ecosystems to past ones, showing that today's balance rests on countless forgotten arrangements. What they whisper is not warning or regret, it is context. They remind us that Earth has hosted many rulers, each adapted fully to a moment that could not last. They show that extinction leaves no scar on the planet's surface, only a rearrangement. The ground absorbs endings and holds them gently until someone learns to listen. In the quiet presence of these remains, time feels layered rather than linear. Past and present coexist, separated by stone rather than distance. The ghosts still in the ground do not ask to be remembered. They persist anyway, offering glimpses of lives that once defined their world and now exist only as echoes pressed into rock, steady and unchanging beneath our feet. The story of the terror birds does not remain sealed in the past. It carries forward into the present through patterns that still shape modern animals and the ecosystems they inhabit. Their rise and disappearance offer perspective on how life organizes itself under pressure and how easily that organization can shift when conditions change. Modern animals live within systems built from layers of past adjustments. Predators and prey move through landscapes shaped by long sequences of dominance and replacement. Even without knowing it, today's species inherit behaviors and body forms influenced by ancient balances. Speed, vigilance, grouping, and timing often trace their roots to pressures imposed by rulers that no longer exist. The absence of terror birds did not erase their influence. It redistributed it, folding lessons learned under one regime into the structure of the next. For modern predators, their story underscores the cost of specialization. Many successful hunters today remain adaptable in diet and behavior, even when capable of remarkable precision. This flexibility is not accidental. It reflects deep evolutionary memory of what happens when dominance narrows options too tightly. Survival in variable environments favors those who can adjust without fully reinventing themselves. Modern ecosystems reflect this lesson as well. They are rarely built around a single controlling force. Instead, influence spreads across many interactions, creating redundancy that softens disruption. When one species declines, others often shift to fill portions of its role. This does not prevent loss, but it reduces collapse. Complexity becomes a form of insurance, allowing life to persist through disturbance. The fragile balance within these systems can be difficult to notice because it often appears stable on the surface. Forests grow, grasslands spread, predators hunt, prey evade. Yet the story of the terror birds reminds us that stability is conditional. It depends on climate, connectivity, and diversity holding within certain bounds. When those bounds are crossed, change can arrive quietly and move quickly. For humans, this perspective encourages humility. Modern ecosystems are not fixed achievements, they are moments in motion. The same forces that ended ancient reigns still operate today, reshaping landscapes under pressure from climate shifts, habitat fragmentation, and altered food webs. The difference is not the presence of change, but the speed and scale at which it now unfolds. The terror birds show that disappearance does not require cruelty or failure. It can emerge from misalignment between life and environment. Recognizing this helps modern science approach conservation with realism rather than nostalgia. Protecting species means protecting the conditions that allow their strategies to work. Without those conditions, preservation becomes symbolic rather than effective. Their story also reframes how balance is understood. Balance is not permanence, it is movement constrained within limits. When limits stretch or snap, balance reorganizes. This process is neither moral nor sentimental. It is how Earth continues to host life across changing worlds. The lesson lies not in resisting change entirely, but in understanding where margins have grown thin. In reflecting on the terror birds, there is an invitation to observe modern nature more closely, to notice where specialization concentrates risk, where diversity provides cushion, and where systems rely on narrow alignments that may not endure. These observations do not predict outcomes, but they sharpen awareness. What their story means for us is not a warning spoken aloud, but a pattern made visible. Life persists through responsiveness, not dominance. Ecosystems endure through complexity, not simplicity. Balance survives through flexibility, not force. The terror birds ruled their world fully, and when that world shifted, rule gave way to memory. In that quiet transition, their story became part of the guidance written into the living earth, still unfolding beneath every modern step. The earth has carried many rulers across its long history, each reigning within a world that felt complete while it lasted. These worlds did not overlap in the way pages overlap in a book. They replaced one another through gradual shifts, layered so deeply that the present rests on countless former arrangements. Each age believed in its own permanence, yet each became a foundation for something new. Long before familiar ecosystems took shape, forests of towering club mosses covered wetlands under humid skies, ruled by insects whose sizes no longer seem possible. Later, shallow seas filled with armored fish spread across continents, forming aquatic kingdoms that ended when environments deepened and diversified. After them came the age of giant reptiles, followed by mammals that reshaped land through different rhythms of growth and care. Each transition marked the end of a ruling pattern and the beginning of another. These worlds were not brief experiments. Many lasted millions of years, longer than any human sense of time can hold comfortably. They developed complex interactions, stable food webs, and predictable seasons. Creatures evolved behaviors finely tuned to those conditions. From within, they likely felt enduring. From above, across deep time, they appear temporary. The endings were not always sudden. Some worlds faded slowly as climates drifted and continents rearranged. Others ended more sharply, when volcanic episodes, ocean changes, or atmospheric shifts compressed change into narrow intervals. Regardless of pace, the result was the same. A complete way of living reached its boundary and gave way. What makes these kings forgotten is not the absence of impact, but the thoroughness of renewal. New rulers did not rule alongside the old for long. They reshaped landscapes, altered prey, and redirected energy until earlier dominance left little trace at the surface. Memory was sealed beneath layers of sediment, preserved but hidden. The number of these worlds is vast. Every major shift in climate, chemistry, or geography created conditions for a different balance of power. Oceans alone have hosted multiple successions of apex predators, each adapted to currents, temperatures, and prey communities that no longer exist. On land, the same pattern repeats across eras defined by forests, grasslands, ice, and heat. Each configuration allowed certain forms to rise and limited others, producing distinct hierarchies that ended when alignment broke. How many ended cannot be counted precisely because boundaries blur, extinctions overlap, survivors carry fragments of old worlds forward, yet the record is clear that endings are more common than continuities. Stability is temporary, even when it lasts longer than imagination. The present world is one such chapter. Its kings feel familiar because they surround us, but they are no more permanent than those that came before. The earth does not erase its history, it builds upon it. Past worlds remain embedded below, influencing soil, fossil fuels, and even the shapes of continents that guide today's weather. In this perspective, forgetting is not loss, it is transformation. Each ended world contributes material, structure, and constraint to the next. What survives is not dominance, but the capacity of life to reorganize. The terror birds joined a lineage of rulers that defined their time completely, only to be absorbed into a deeper continuity. Dinosaurs, ancient sharks, giant insects, and countless others share this fate. Their reigns ended, yet the earth remained generous with possibility. To see the planet this way is to understand that kingship in nature is always provisional. Worlds form, flourish, and conclude, making room for new arrangements to follow. Beneath every step lies a stacked inheritance of vanished powers. The earth carries them all, quietly, as it continues forward, preparing foundations for worlds yet to come. As this long story settles, the end does not arrive with noise or collapse, but with quiet understanding. Extinction, as Earth practices it, is not an explosion that clears the stage. It is a gradual release where once dominant lives loosen their hold and the world reshapes itself without ceremony. The terror birds disappeared, not with drama, but with patience, leaving behind a planet that continued to breathe, grow, and rearrange. This quiet power of extinction is easy to misunderstand. It is not erasure. Nothing is truly lost in the way we often imagine. The energy, matter, and space once claimed by vanished rulers flows onward into new forms. Grass grows where paths once ran, predators rise where others fell. The process is calm, persistent, and unstoppable, guided not by intention, but by balance constantly seeking new expression. Lost worlds still matter because they explain why the present looks the way it does. Modern ecosystems carry the imprint of earlier reigns in subtle ways. Bodies, behaviors, and relationships reflect pressures that no longer exist but once shaped survival. Understanding those worlds gives context to today's fragility. It shows that stability is always temporary and that resilience comes not from dominance but from diversity and responsiveness. The story of the terror birds invites a slower kind of attention. It asks us to look beneath the surface of the familiar and recognize how many complete worlds existed before our own moment arrived. Each was complex, functional, and convincing while it lasted. Each felt permanent to the life within it, and each ended quietly, leaving the planet ready for something else. This perspective changes how extinction is held in thought. It is neither triumph nor tragedy on its own. It is transition, a reminder that life moves forward by letting go as much as by building. In seeing this, the past becomes less distant. The vanished rulers do not feel gone so much as folded into a longer, deeper continuity that still surrounds us. Earth's history is not a ladder, but a tide. Forms rise, spread, and recede, leaving shape and sediment behind. The terror birds rode that tide for millions of years, shaping continents and fear before slipping beneath the surface. Their story matters because it sharpens awareness of how thin the present moment truly is and how much rests below it. As this journey comes to rest, there is no need to rush back to the present. These stories linger best when allowed to drift, settling gently into memory. If this quiet exploration of deep time has brought you a sense of calm or curiosity, a small gesture of support means more than you might expect. A simple like helps this work find others who value slow science and thoughtful storytelling. Subscribing allows this shared space to keep growing, one gentle story at a time. And if you wish to continue, there are many more hidden histories waiting just beneath the surface. Countless forgotten worlds, strange creatures, and quiet transitions remain to be explored, each with its own rhythm and lesson. For now, let this story rest where all stories eventually do, folded into the larger one that Earth has been telling for billions of years, patient and ongoing, inviting us to listen a little longer.